Hi everyone, I'm Cassandra and welcome back to the Oxford Weaving Studio YouTube channel. In today's tutorial, we're going to continue our Weaving Basics series of videos. We're going to show you how to tie in all those loose ends at the back of your woven sample once you've completed it. So let's get started. Hi, thanks so much for joining me for this tutorial on how to finish the back of your weaving. That's tucking in all the yarns and the thick wool roving in the different sizes that you have. We're going to start by talking about the tools that you're going to need for this. So everybody works differently. And over the years, I've discovered that people like to use different types of tools, but I'm going to show you all the different ones that we use here in the Oxford Weaving Studio for our workshops. Of course, one of the most handy pairs of scissors is a pair of Fiskars scissors, but any good textile or fibre scissors are really useful to have. A pair of snips. Now this is a great tool that I've just started using recently for smaller fibres and getting down close to the edges of your the backs of your weaving, so they're quite handy. Tapestry needle. That's one of the useful tools that pretty much everybody will know how to use and be familiar with. I will note, however, that of course, this tapestry needle is quite large. You can see the eye here is huge and the tip is dull, so it's not pointy. This is actually a number one needle, and actually we like to include in our yarn starter packs and our kits. We like to use to offer 3 different sizes, but basically the opening will then be much more accommodating to the different types of materials you use. And for example, of course, with these thick materials like such tapestry yarns, the chunky yarns, and even the wool roving won't be good with the needles, but having a different option is always useful. So that's tapestry needle. And actually for me, my favorite tool is really the crochet hook. So I'm just gonna sneak this one out. This is actually a 4mm hook. It really depends on the thickness of the yarns you're using, but I tend to use a crochet hook that ranges from between 3 and 4mm, because this slightly smaller size will allow both the use of the thinner yarns that you're working with, but also the thick chunky wool roving. And I'll show you how to use those in a minute. So those are the tools that I sort of interchange with regularly. And I've chosen this project today because it works beautifully to illustrate the different types of yarns. So we've got some finer cottons, we've got some finer tapestry sort of wool, we've got thicker, chunkier merino, and we've also got some wool roving. So each of these different types of materials can sometimes require a different way to finish them. When I finish a piece, I always like to look at whether or not the yarn is sitting what I call on the front of the piece of the work, and so that when it's tucked back it covers the end warp thread, or if it actually exposes it. And actually I've got 2 right here in the middle that illustrate this idea perfectly. And if you can see here, this light pink one, if I was going to tuck this one behind, can you see how, if you imagine this warp string here, it's going to actually cover this warp string. So it's going to look like every other row beneath it, and it's going to have a really nice finish. However, if you look at the wool roving above it, if I tuck that one behind, can you see that it actually exposes the warp thread? Now you obviously don't want that, because you want a unified look as best as you can. So that's one point to remember. However, normally what we like to do is, if we find a yarn that does that, exposes the end warp thread, what you like to do, the best thing is to tuck it in and sort of hook it through already, pushing it through so that it actually creates a little loop so that it covers the warp threads. So you get a more consistent look where it's covering the warp threads and it doesn't look out of place. However, I will also note that for me, when I look at this, I'm of 2 minds. Yes, it is covering the warp thread, which we've just discussed, but also I kind of think that it's adding a little bit of extra bulk to the side of this, this finished edge. So there is an argument, and this will depend on the person and the type of project you're working on, but there is an argument for you not doing what I just said. And this really only applies for really thick, chunky yarns. You'll see in a moment when we start to actually tuck them in. But there is an argument for you to just, for the moment, leave it tucked behind, and we'll see if there is a way for us to finish it so that it doesn't interfere with the overall look, because sometimes when you're tucking in your ends, you can actually create, you will see what you've done from the front, and it'll either look bulkier and impact the actual pattern on the front. So I'm going to leave the thick chunky ones, but I just thought I'd bring this up for a moment. Now you can see what a difference the back is. Of course, I've just started to tuck some ends in, like I was explaining, this side that started to, but this is really what it looks like once I've finished weaving. I like to weave quite freely, and then I deal with all the tucking in at the ends afterwards. Now, we're going to start with, usually I like to start with the top, and I like to work my way down. So if we go to this first cream color up here, you can see here, this is a cotton yarn, and it's got lots of little, it's made up of lots of little fibers. This one, I essentially tucked behind over here, and I'm going to show you this first one. So if you can imagine, these two chunky yarns explains perfectly, it illustrates perfectly what I was trying to say earlier about what happens when you tuck your yarns back. So if you can imagine from the front, if we were tucking them behind, we would be doing this. From the back, that's what it would look like. Can you see here, we've exposed this warp thread right here. We don't want that. Now I said I was of two minds with the thick wool roving. For the ones that are just, let's call them the easy ones, what you simply do is you reach in behind the warp threads. Now I use a tapestry needle. That again is my go-to trick. You can use your fingers if it makes sense, but I find a tapestry needle really helps. So I essentially feed it in. I'm left-handed, so I always work going forward, and then like a bad magician who gets taken off the stage, you pull through and away for you to the side stage. So we grab the end of it on the needle, tucking very gently and pulling through. Now you can see here, once it started to get tucked through, I don't keep pulling. What I try and do is take the tapestry needle off, and I use my fingers to gingerly pull it free. And the reason why is that you don't want to try and distort your whole piece by pulling too tight. So you can see here, I've pulled through the edge so that it sits quite nice. I've pulled in on the same row. Now there's different, again, arguments for where you want to pull through, but with the wool roving, you try and do it on the same row, and then you take either your scissors or your snips and you trim it down. Now, I like to use scissors for wool roving, and then you put the bits to the side. Now for the harder one, the one above, again, just to remind you what it looks like, and maybe I should show it a bit closer in the frame. If I was to tuck this one behind, you see how it's exposing the warp thread. Now there's two things you can do. If you're starting from the front, like I mentioned earlier, you can simply going through the middle, tucking it and wrapping it around that outside warp thread. Now from the front, you can see here that it hasn't distorted it too much. However, it does leave a slight bump. Now it has the bump on the other side as well. So maybe that, for the moment, for me, I think that fits quite well. Let's explore how it looks with some other ones. So if we were to then leave that one, not trim it just for the moment, we've got another one in the same situation that once it's been exposed, we have to think about what we do with it. So I always suggest pulling it in, wrapping it around behind, through the middle, again, between the other colors, not below, so that below you often notice it quite strongly. Again, let's see what it looks like from the front. That looks secure for the moment. And if we have a look from the front, now does that look nice and tidy to you? I think actually not so bad. We've got another one here. Again, we're gonna take a look. We can do it from the front this time. Again, taking it from the front, moving it along through the through the middle, pulling it tight, and let's see if we can do that a bit tighter from this side. Okay, so now it's starting to look a little bit busier. Now, some of you may like this, some of you may not. I don't think it actually does too much harm in the end. I think really I'm happy with that. But for those of you who don't like that, what you would do is you would have to be very careful when you're tucking it behind that you don't expose that warp thread too severely. So you might do a very loose tuck. Now, go back to the back. So going back with our tools, this one here hasn't yet been tucked in. You see how we did this first one under the first two? We're going to go back with our tool, our tapestry needle, and I'm going in 2 to 3 from the inside and tucking it through the back. And now what we want to also be careful of is that when we are tucking through, you have the choice of tucking every single end you have the choice to tuck it either behind the warp thread or the weft thread. Now the difference is that you never want it to show from the front. That's the main secret. You try as best you can to hide it wherever it won't be seen, usually, again, using it on the same color. So for example, if I was to try and tuck a brown end behind the cream, there's a pretty good chance that some of the brown may show up from the front on the cream, which you never want. So it's always best to try and stick with the same color or very similar colors. You could probably get away with cream and this sort of minky tone, and they wouldn't impede too much, but you really want to be careful that you're getting it the right way. So again, once you've got it through, you get your scissors or your snips and you just trim the ends. Now we're going to continue down with one of the thicker ones. So here's one that we tucked from the front. I quite liked that, as we said. Again, what are we going to do? We're going to pick it up. Again, I'm left-handed, but I still use my right hand for many things. Again, I can go in the top row or I can go in the row below. I'm preferring to use the warp threads because if I was to use the weft threads, and let's use this one, for example. This one is a really good, it's super long, so I can show it to you. If you try and go through the weft threads and you're coming up from underneath and you're doing the same technique, but using the weft thread, pulling it down underneath, pulling it through. I'm sure most of you are already going to guess what's going to happen. But once I've pulled it down through, looking at it from the other side, because that's always our barometer for how is it working. And then we see that we've stuffed up the front. Yeah, essentially we've messed with the pattern that's showing from the front. So you never cut before you're ready and checking the front to make sure that it's all in place. So we're going to unpick that one. So going back, with thick wool roving, it's always the warp. And the reason why is your fingers also and your tools can get in behind the warp threads far easier than they can without messing up the weft threads. So again, with this purple one, coming in under just a couple, you don't need a huge number. 1, 2, 3. And again, you notice how I'm not hooking straight from the edge. Now, of course, that's the tendency. Everybody will just naturally, when they're using a crochet hook, pull straight from the edge. It's a lot harder to get your roving or any of the other yarns to move when you're coming straight from the edge. So I always tend to make a little loop, feed the loop onto the edge of the crochet hook, and then pull. And then you, again, releasing it, and then with our fingers, because it's much more straightforward and you can work gingerly with that so you don't disrupt anything, and trying to mirror exactly what's underneath so that you just don't distort the front. And then again, taking your scissors and trimming it close. So you don't want to trim it too close. Now you could do 3, 4, 5. You can go straight under, as many as you want, but I find that ends up adding bulk to the back of your project. And also it's not really necessary for you to do that. So this one here was one of the ones earlier that we tucked in, and I'm going to show you very quickly. Again, 1, 2, hook, under, twisting as I go, just to ease it off, remove it, and then slowly tuck it and bring it to the edge, snip, and then check again, always checking. So there we have it. So that's how you do the wool roving. So I'm going to show you now how to work and tuck behind all your different thicknesses of yarn. So we've got some cotton, macrame cord, we've got some rug wool, and we've got some merino. And we'll forget about the roving for a moment. So we're going to start with this one here. First of all, the check is, if again, thinking from the front, if you're tucking it behind, you can see how here is just wrapping nicely around. This one, on the other hand, I've already tucked behind because I could see that it exposed the front. So the difference between this one here is, can you see how densely packed it is? There are no warp threads for you to see. Much like here in the wool roving, you can very clearly see where you could hang them, tuck your ends. For this, you're going to have to go under the weft threads. So the way you do that is, if you've got your yarn here, I like to go in under the 2nd or 3rd row. Depends on how busy your back is. This obviously is quite open and it's a bigger piece, so we don't have to worry too much about traffic, as I call it. But essentially you're going in, gently tucking in underneath And again, you can use your tapestry needle or you can use your crochet hook. I might actually use a tapestry needle for this one. It's being a bit fussy, but I've gone in under just 2 at the back. Again, hooking it at the end, twisting gently, pulling down, and then being mindful of how tight you pull your edge so that it doesn't undo. So here, can you see how I bulked up these 2? That's quite a normal thing that happens when you're pulling. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to mess around with it too much so that it actually shows from the front. So bear with me, I'm going to flip this over. So now you can't see here that we have just tucked in the other edge, and it has not distorted the front here very much. It's actually done a really good job to hide it. So that's what you want to achieve. You want to try and get a seamless looking end tucked behind. Can I also go back to the point about color? For example, if we had tried to hide this brighter pink underneath the lighter pink, you would no doubt have seen this darker color coming through just a little bit on the front. Even though it's densely packed, there's a good chance. So always stick to the same color if you can, or the same tone. So these 2 pinks might work together. The blues, you know, they might work well, but not bright and dark. Okay, so we're going to go back to the other side. We're going to show you just a few more, and then we're just going to get on with it. Okay, now we've got our work back on the back. So I've already gone and snipped this one here, but I've got this other one, this other tail. If you recall, this is one of the ones that earlier, when it was, before I actually turned it around, oops, and tucked it in, there we go. It's a bit stuck. There we go. So this one was where it finished off before. It was a long tail. In order to tuck it around, can you see here when it's pulled back, it exposes the warp thread. So I go in with my crochet hook, again putting that at the end, turning, twisting, pulling through, and then it's tucked nicely here. Now you can also use a tapestry needle. So this cotton is a bit of a pain because once you press on the tip, it likes to splay itself, but that's okay. I've got it here. Again, working in the same way. You want to go back, so that doesn't come out. You want to go back under 2, 3 of them. Now here, this is, in some ways, the tapestry needle works really well because it's not as thick as the crochet hook, and it actually doesn't disturb the weft thread so much, but it's the same premise, going under from behind to the front, hoping that you haven't distorted it, and I know from experience that it's not going to do anything, snipping it off, and then you've got 2 tidy ends for that. We'll show you again. I'll use the tapestry needle this time. Through the edge. Again, picking your line. Where do you want to tuck them? I go in the second one from the end, trying not to distort. 2 or 3 from the end. Up, pull through, and then snip. And then the merino. The merino, I use the crochet hook because it's a bit thicker. Again, going down, under, through the warp threads. And can you see here, of course, from one side, I'm going up, I'm pushing up, I'm hooking, and of course I'm pulling down to hide it. When it's at the bottom, I just work in the opposite direction. Opposite direction, I want to go up. So I come from above, and I come down, and I pull up. Again, that's just because of the direction of everything. And then pull up. So that when I pull too much, you can see you can just ease it off with your fingers and then make sure it's sitting nicely. And then you snip that. So that's how you tie in and tuck in all your ends. So thanks very much for joining me on this tutorial. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you. Please get in touch at info@oxfordweavingstudio.com. And of course, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel if you have found this useful and liked the video, if you've gotten something out of it. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.